The Skunk House, written by GorillaOfUndeath. When I was around 6 years old, it was common that my parents would take me over to my grandfather's house. My mom's side of the family lived far away, so it was rare to see her mom and dad. And, needless to say, it was hard to build a connection with them. But on my father's side, I had my grandfather. I had never known my grandmother, and at that time, it wasn't something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. At least, not until the kids at school started talking about their families, specifically their grandmothers. That was when I started to wonder about her absence. When I would ask my parents about her, they would get real quiet, often taking glances at each other in what I now understand was an effort to get the other to answer this difficult question. If they did answer, they were always vague on where she was or what had happened. They would say things like, "She's in a better place," or "She's passed on." At the time, I had no idea what this really meant, but I didn't press the issue. I always enjoyed spending time with my grandpa. He had what seemed to be an endless supply of applesauce and one of those candy dishes that he would always fill before I came over. My dad had to talk to him about giving me too many sweets, but Grandpa just wanted me to be happy. Grandpa would regale me with his tales from when he was a boy, and sometimes he'd come out to play with me in the backyard when he was feeling up to it. There were days, though, where it would be too much for him to be out and about, so we would stay inside and play checkers together. He tried to show me chess, but checkers was more fun at that age. It was during one of these great games of checkers that I asked him where Grandma was. I could see his mood change almost instantly. He went from happily playing a game with me to sad in almost an instant. His old chair creaked as he got up and excused himself, telling me that I should watch the TV for a bit. I never asked him about Grandma after that. Now, my grandfather lived in a bad neighborhood, and I don't mean that in the usual sense of high crime, poverty, and drug-addicted people. No, more in the sense that the entire neighborhood smelled of skunk. It was plagued by the smell, and the source of it stemmed from an odd couple that kept a group of skunks as pets in a house at the end of the cul-de-sac. When my father would drive me over to my grandfather's house, we would always be met by that disgusting smell emanating from that house like it was some sort of stink factory. My grandpa liked to call it the Skunk House, though the subject of the Skunk House was a source of great anger to him, reasonably so, I'd say. The Flendersons, as they were called, would raise skunks, but they failed to have the scent glands ever removed from them for reasons that were unknown to anyone but them. The prevailing theory on it was the cost was too much for them. But in turn, this meant that the neighborhood and all of its inhabitants paid the price. The Flendersons and their skunks had enraged my grandfather. He had mounted several campaigns to try and get the couple to move elsewhere or get rid of those skunks. Almost the entire community was behind him, and there was a great effort to get the Flendersons out of there. Legally, though, the couple had a permit to raise skunks, and you just couldn't force people to move off their property. The campaign stirred up a lot of hatred, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. My grandfather had tried to move, but selling his house was a near impossibility when the air always had the stink of skunk in it. He would receive a few lowball offers, but they were nowhere near what he needed to find a suitable place elsewhere. Of course, I found out much of this as I grew older and my dad filled me in. But at the time, I just knew that it smelled like skunk there, and that the Skunk House was where it came from. It was late one afternoon that my grandpa fell asleep in his favorite chair. I was bored, and even though I wasn't supposed to, I decided to take a quick walk around the neighborhood. Aside from the skunk smell, the area was a nice place to walk around. It was like a picturesque suburban neighborhood that you'd see in old ads and movies. Everything was well maintained and everyone was happy. But I guess reality held a different picture, because everyone here probably hated it, and there was one house in total disarray. The Skunk House was a total eyesore for the entire neighborhood. The front yard was overgrown. The siding of the house was falling off. Assorted pieces of trash littered the yard. The roof looked like it was falling apart. I could go on and on about the ugliness of that house. I was still curious, though, about the skunk house as I walked by. So I slowed my pace greatly as I walked. The smell got stronger as I approached it, but that didn't deter me. Part of me wanted to see a skunk. I actually thought that they were pretty cool looking from what I'd seen in pictures. I guessed that somebody saw me from the window because within seconds the front door opened and an older man peered out at me from his doorway. The smell got even worse when the door opened. It was intense and my eyes started to water a bit from it. I had no idea how someone could live there with that smell. The man was incredibly obese. The kind of obese that meant that he would waddle around on fat legs for a few steps before being out of breath. He wore a yellow wife beater that I swear was probably white at one point, and his black sweatpants were filled with stains from who knows what. "What you looking at, boy?" the man shouted at me from his doorstep. A moment later, the man was pushed aside by a woman who I only assumed was his wife. She was even fatter than the man. Her face was dirtied by some sort of barbecue sauce. Her shirt clung to her, wet with what I think was skunk spray, or perhaps just her own sweat. She carried a skunk in one arm like a rich woman with a fur coat carries a small poodle or a chihuahua. The two of them looked like they both had not showered in weeks, and the smell by this point was sickening. "Otis, it's just a baby," she snapped at the man, who angrily backed off, walking back into the stinky house. The woman stepped out of the house and started towards me with that slow waddling movement. The skunk squirmed in her arm, trying to get away, but she clung to it tightly. The skunk was lodged between layers of fat in her arm, and in desperation I watched as the skunk started to spray her. The gross liquid wet her shirt even more and then trickled down her crusty sweatpants. "Oh dear, he made a whoopsie again," she said as she kept approaching me. I was scared by her at this point. These people were not normal. I backed away, getting ready to run away from the disgusting woman and that house. "Why don't you come inside? We've got some snacks you can eat. Come on in, dear, it'll be fun." The woman cooed at me as she continued her slow approach. But I turned and sprinted off in the other direction. I think that was the fastest that I've ever run. "Oh, come on, dear, you can play with the skunks," she shouted at me as I ran off. No way was I going into that house or any closer to that disgusting woman and her husband. I immediately went back to my grandpa's and tried to pretend that nothing had happened. But I think that my grandpa knew immediately because he made me take a tomato bath, and he told me to never go near that place again. I could only nod my head, and nothing more was ever said about the place. I never really tried going back outside after that incident. Even going into the backyard with Grandpa lost its appeal, and I opted to stay indoors when I was at Grandpa's place. I didn't want to be anywhere near that skunk house. The place just gave me the creeps. Years later, my grandpa passed away. I was old enough to know what that meant now. My dad told me that he had suffered a heart attack, and though they tried to help him with an open heart surgery, he ended up dying on the operating table. It was one of the saddest days of my life. I knew what had happened to my grandfather, but the mystery of what happened to my grandmother still rested in the back of my head. I decided to ask my dad again one day about what had happened to Grandma. My dad only let out a sigh, and his usual smile changed to an unapproving scowl. But he sat me down and calmly told me that right before I was born, she had gone missing. It was during one of my grandfather's campaigns to remove the Flendersons from the neighborhood that she had disappeared one day. They searched for her everywhere, but the police were unable to ever find her. She was never considered deceased. but everyone knew that it was incredibly unlikely that she was still alive, especially after a few years had passed with no trace of her. This revelation was startling to me, but it was a few years after that we would discover what actually happened to my grandma. I'll summarize as best I can what led to this discovery. Mrs. Flinderson, that obese woman with the pet skunks who had invited me into her home when I was a boy, had at some point wandered into her front yard. Reports here differ. Some say that she had a massive heart attack and died on the spot. Others say that she collapsed due to her immense weight. Whatever the case, Miss Flinderson fell to the ground face first. For 3 days, she lay there, and not a soul in the neighborhood called 911 or tried to help her. The residents all claimed that they didn't notice because the grass was so overgrown. But many speculate that it was a sort of retribution, letting her lay there like that. It was an unlucky male driver who made the call to 911 when he saw her on his drive through the neighborhood. The paramedics and police arrived, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The next step by the police was to locate the husband, but they had no idea where he was. Knocking on the door to the home did nothing except to alert the skunks inside, who would viciously start spraying their scents. Both cars the couple owned were still in the driveway. Fearing that the husband may also be in trouble, the police donned masks and protective suits, and they forced their way into the home. What they found made headline news for weeks in my town and its surrounding areas. To start with, the house itself was in total disarray, things falling apart, garbage everywhere. It was obvious after the fact that the couple were a pair of hoarders. Then, of course, there were the skunks. There were dozens of them running around. Many of them were poorly fed and neglected. But this was not the greatest crime. What they found in the basement was a grotesque nightmare of dead skunks, dead human bodies, and a chaotic mess of blood, body parts, skunk spray, and all other manner of gross bodily fluids. When all was said and done, they found 7 human bodies in that basement, and one survivor who, as of now, will still not speak publicly about what went on down there. Among the remains, they were able to identify my grandmother using dental records and forensics. Otis Flinderson was also discovered. He had died of a stroke, and his wife, rather than bury him, simply tossed him into the basement and pretended that nothing had happened. There were also 4 children who were all missing, and 2 teenagers, one of which was the sole survivor. No one could detect the smell of the decaying bodies due to the overwhelming smell of the skunks, and the police had neglected to ever search the house because they didn't want to get sprayed. The abuse the victims suffered was incredibly horrific. Evidence from the crime scene suggests that the victims were locked down in the basement and chained to the wall, where they would be fed very little, if anything at all. The skunks would spray the victims out of fear, and when it came to the point of starvation, the skunks would begin cannibalizing their own dead. But it didn't stop there. They had also reportedly eaten from the corpses of the humans, as evidenced by bits and pieces of Otis Flinderson being gone and later discovered in the stomach of one of the dead skunks. The victim's one saving grace, and let me tell you, it's not much of a consolation, was that Otis Flinderson, who apparently was only slightly less evil than his miserable, rotten wife, would sometimes lumber downstairs and suffocate the victims in a sort of mercy killing. After Otis had died and been put in the basement, the final 2 victims, the 2 teenagers, were left to rot away until death by the evil wife. The teenager who survived only barely clung to life, and will more than likely be haunted by this grisly crime for the rest of her life. Needless to say, the house has since been razed, and several local and state politicians have vowed to try and change the laws regarding exotic animal ownership, and neighborhood laws that would help to prevent people from doing something like this again. The police were also brought under heavy scrutiny. many of them being fired for misconduct and failure to protect the public from these horrific crimes. Though our family was devastated by finding out this news, we were all a little relieved that Grandpa didn't have to learn of what had happened to his beloved wife. I think back now to that day that I asked him about my grandma and the pained expression that he gave me. I think now that he left the room because he was going to cry. There was no way that he could handle discovering this. I'm glad that he can rest in peace not knowing the atrocities that took place. As for my father, he and several other families of the victims are being represented by a hotshot lawyer in suing the local and state police for failing in their duties. So far, things are looking like a slam dunk case. I still think back to that day when that disgusting woman invited me inside, and I realize that I was fortunate not to be another one of those poor victims, locked in that dark basement with the stench of skunk and death all around me.